In this video series, we'll take you back to the very end of the Pleistocene epoch, when the last of the massive glaciers that once loomed for millennia over the middle of the North American continent finally retreated northwards, their glacial meltwaters leaving behind a trail of coniferous forests and marshy wetlands.
We'll explore Ice Age megafauna, in particular mastodons and mammoths, the giant beasts that once roamed in abundance across northeast Illinois. We'll visit 3 sites in DuPage County, Illinois, all 3 of which have yielded significant finds related to these extinct behemoths. All 3 are preserved and protected within DuPage County Forest Preserve lands, and all 3 are available for you to visit today.
And for our sources, we will use the scientific papers that accompanied these finds. Wheaton College photographs and records, the DuPage County Forest Preserve archives, the knowledge of local experts such as Dr. Stephen Moshier of Wheaton College and Jack McRae of the DuPage County Forest Preserves, contemporary newspaper articles, U.S. Census records, and original and period maps.
From the earliest times of European migration and settlement into the DuPage River Valley of northern Illinois, the area to the southwest of the bend in the east branch of the DuPage River, in what is today the Churchill Woods Forest Preserve, has been natural wetland, marked by marshes and fens.
We know that Native Americans have used this location in the past. In historical times, the Potawatomi tribe camped along the north shore of the DuPage River bend in the mid-1830s, while awaiting migration west of the Mississippi after their lands had been taken by the encroaching European settlers. Native Americans would have made extensive use of the marshes for hunting wild fowl and game, as well as taking fish from the river.
The earliest recorded European settlers of this land were the Winslow Churchill family, who arrived from New York in the mid-1830s. Family members eventually laid claim to most of the land to the north and south of St. Charles Road, encompassing the area today known as Churchill Woods and Churchill Prairie. Winslow and his wife Mary Dodge, whose cabin stood on the northwest corner of St. Charles Road and Swift Road, claimed the land north of St. Charles in the 1830s. And years later, their daughter Lorania and husband John Ackerman claimed the western portion of Churchill Woods. Their son Hiram took the middle portion, and son Seth took the eastern portion.
Down through the years, the land belonging to the Ackermans, which encompassed the western portion of Churchill Woods, was parceled up into smaller farmettes and building lots. But with the exception of some modest agricultural use, the marshes, fens, and wetlands of this DuPage River topography remained relatively unchanged.
Enter the Perry family, who arrived 100 years after the Churchills in the 1930s, moving into a home along Rifford Road in Glen Ellyn, Illinois, and who over the course of time acquired up to 18 acres of the land extending from their property eastward into Churchill Woods, including a significant portion of the natural wetlands we see today.
Joseph Samuel Perry was born in Alabama in 1896, the son of a coal miner, in the town aptly named Carbon Hill. After serving in Europe in the U.S. Navy during World War I, Perry returned to his home and earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Alabama, then traveled north to the University of Chicago, where he earned a master's degree, and then a law degree in 1927. He started a law practice in Chicago, then married Nell Brookman, a schoolteacher born in La Crosse, Wisconsin, before moving to DuPage County in the mid-1930s. By the late 1930s, Perry launched a political career and was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives as a Democrat, serving from 1937 until 1943. He continued his legal profession in Wheaton following World War II, and then in 1951 was nominated by President Harry Truman to be seated as a judge on the United States District Court for Northern Illinois, where he served for the remainder of his life.
In 1963, Judge Sam Perry, as he was usually called, and his wife Nellie wanted to enhance the wetlands behind their house along Rifford Road, perhaps desiring a more picturesque pond rather than a boggy marsh. At that time, their reedy pond was landlocked, just touching on a portion of their formal backyard. They hired Naperville heavy equipment operator Marshall Moeller Erb to dredge the pond area and to connect it with the drainage pond to the north, a waterway which directly fed into the east branch of the DuPage River. Connecting the two bodies of water would permanently raise the water level of the Perry's formerly landlocked southern pond.
Erb started the Perry work in mid-October of 1963, using a dragline bucket excavator to do the job, focusing his efforts on the northwest corner of the pond, where he hoped to create a breach of the wall separating the two ponds behind the Perry home. On Wednesday, October 16th, while removing tons of mud and silt, Erb's bucket unexpectedly latched onto a heavy article, almost 4 feet long, pulled from the mire. Erb immediately recognized this singular find as a large bone of some sort, and so notified Nelle Perry, who, after discussing with her husband Sam, decided to halt the pond excavation until some local experts could be brought in for a closer look.
Wheaton College was just 2.5 miles to the west of the Perry home, and the college, along with the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, were called in to consult on Marshall Erb's serendipitous find. The experts immediately identified the large object as a femur, or thigh bone, of a large proboscidean, a mammoth or a mastodon, Ice Age ancestors to today's elephants. They advised the Perrys to search for additional skeletal remains of the animal, as the unearthed femur was in a remarkably good state of preservation.
The Perrys agreed to the extended search, but gave the condition that the excavation had to be completed within 8 days, as heavy machine contractor Erb was on the clock and needed to complete the pond work before winter weather set in. So the academics had to work fast, quickly rearranging their busy work and class schedules in what was to be an exhilarating yet exhausting salvage paleontological dig. Wheaton College's assistant professor of geology, Douglas Block, was put in charge of the excavation, supported by the Chicago Field Museum's chief preparator, Orville Gilpin. Much of the backbreaking labor for the excavation came from Wheaton College students, most being geology majors, such as John Stowen, Larry Benson, Jim Gill, and Charlotte Maynink, as well as some local volunteers.
As the dig site was still largely under the pond's silty waters, the Perry South Pond needed to be pumped dry to enable the excavation team to gain direct access to any additional buried skeletal remains. Since Erb's work had not yet united the two ponds, they were able to pump water from the Perry's landlocked South Pond to the northern drainage pond, draining the excavation site of water, with the pumps operating continuously thereafter in order to keep the water levels low. One of Erb's bulldozers then shifted much of the pond silt away from the excavation site, thereby enabling the diggers to more directly move about the site's muddy terrain.
Moving outward from the location of the initial femur find, the diggers initially chased the skeletal remains to the south and east, first locating a fairly intact tusk and then a rib bone, about 8 feet east of the femur, within 2 days of the initial discovery. The very next day, Saturday, turned out to be the best day of all. Using a metal rod to probe beneath the mud and silt about 20 feet southeast of the original femur discovery, they found and uncovered the animal's fully intact skull, then the second tusk, as well as some loose vertebrae and ribs. The skull in particular proved to be a boon, not only for its outstanding quality, but also for its diagnostic value, as the intact preserved teeth told the team they were dealing with a mastodon specimen, as up to this point it could have been either a mammoth or mastodon. Mastodon teeth are more adapted for breaking down small twigs and branches, whereas mammoth teeth are more adapted for grinding sedges and grass.
Word had spread throughout the local communities of the remarkably well-preserved ancient mammal being exposed along the normally quiet Rifford Road on the northern edge of Glen Ellyn. Over the weekend, scores of spectators lined the Perry Pond banks to watch the excavation unfold, trampling the well-manicured lawns of the Perry neighbors in order to catch a glimpse of paleontological drama in the amphitheater of the emptied pond, acted out by a dozen drained and muddy college students and academics. But there were generally few complaints from Perry's neighbors, as the drama of the dig was a once-in-a-lifetime experience for all who came to see it or participate in it.
In the muck of the pond basin, the finds that had been pointing in the southeast direction then appeared to dry up, or to be so deep as to not be easily found. And so they turned their attention to following the skeletal remains in the opposing direction, heading northwest towards the sloped pond banks. They found another rib about 10 feet east-northeast of the original femur bone. Then moving further northwest, about 20 feet north-northeast of the femur, they unearthed a humerus, the upper bone of the foreleg, then found the animal's second femur, and then another large rib. Chasing the finds further northwest, buried deep in the pond bank, they found the mastodon's complete lower jaw, or mandible, another remarkable prize, at a depth of almost 20 feet below the pond bank. Fortunately, one of the student excavators, Scott Adams, took the time to sketch the location of some of the key skeletal finds, as well as their approximate depth. He noticed that the disarticulated skeletal remains appeared to be running downhill from the location of the skull, suggesting that the Ice Age topography of the land was different than at the time of the excavation.
In the middle of this salvage operation, the excavation team also had the presence of mind to take silt samples, as well as a vertical section of the sediments lining the excavation area just to the south of where the skull was found, along the banks of the pond. Both the silt samples and the soil stratigraphy would be crucial to understanding the environment at the time of, and subsequent to, the burial of the mastodon.
But after several grueling days of digging, the clock had expired, the race had been run, and machine operator Marshall Erb transitioned from being a fossil excavator to a pond excavator once more. Within weeks, Erb's earth-moving work was completed, and the Perry Pond was refilled, submerging and sealing the Mastodon excavation site beneath several feet of water and silt. The excavation team, headed mainly by Wheaton College students and faculty, had nonetheless managed to pull about 110 superbly preserved bones associated with a single mastodon specimen from the muddy silts and peaty bog deposits of the Perry Pond.
As the mastodon bones had been recovered from the Perry property, they legally belonged to the Perry family. But perhaps overwhelmed by the sudden accumulation of massive bones in their garage, Judge Sam and Nelle Perry quickly moved to donate the mastodon skeleton to Wheaton College, especially as the college had spearheaded the bulk of the excavation work.
Wheaton College then set about the mammoth task of cleaning, restoring, and mounting the unique specimens suddenly presented to them. Geology Department Chair Dr. Donald Boardman led this effort, again working with Wheaton College students as well as outside consultants wherever possible. Boardman visited several museums throughout the United States to get perspectives and advice on mounting the large animal. Once the bones had been cleaned and preserved by the college, they brought in the Richard Rush Studio of Chicago, Illinois, a company with previous experience in such museum mountings, to complete the Perry Mastodon work.
Less than half of the specimen's skeletal remains had been excavated, primarily from the animal's left side. The reconstruction used mirrored replicas of bones to fill in missing bones, where possible, as well as casts of bones from other mastodon specimens. In the end, Wheaton College chose to fully reconstruct the left side of the animal, as that constituted the majority of the bones excavated, and then to sculpt the living form of the animal for the display's right side. Louis Paul Jonas, natural history exhibit designer of New York, worked with the Richard Rush Studio to create the right side sculpture of the reconstructed animal.
In 1965, Wheaton College also had the opportunity to publicly discuss their finds on local television. WMAQ's Conversations program gave them such a platform, airing the 30-minute episode discussing the Perry Mastodon finds on the 21st of November 1965, featuring Wheaton College's Douglas Block, Dr. Donald Boardman, as well as students Larry Benson and Larry King.
After years of community fundraising for the project and meticulous reconstruction of the giant jigsaw puzzle, the Perry Mastodon display was finally completed and dedicated in 1975, 12 years after excavation. The display was placed in a prominent position within the college's then science building, Armourding Hall. 35 years on, in 2010, the Perry Mastodon specimen was once again moved to a new home, with much fanfare and local enthusiasm. It was moved to an enlarged exhibit in Wheaton College's newly built Meyer Science Center.
Meanwhile, the site of the Perry Mastodon excavation was changing in its own right. In 1970, Judge Sam and Nelle Perry sold several acres of their land to the DuPage County Forest Preserve, the acquisition then being incorporated into the adjacent Churchill Woods Forest Preserve. In 1984, Judge Perry passed away, with Nelle Perry following him in death 7 years later in 1991. Then in 1995, the Perry estate sold several more acres of the Perry property, again to the DuPage County Forest Preserve. This time the land encompassing the Perry Pond and the former excavation site, with the newly acquired land once again augmenting the Churchill Woods wetlands. As the appetite for Glen Ellyn real estate had swelled over the years, with new housing popping up all around the Perry home and estate, the acquisition of this wetland, an important paleontological site, ensured that this ancient landscape remained open, preserved, and accessible to the public.
What did the Perry Mastodon specimen tell us about these ancient megafauna? And what more have we learned about this specimen and this site in the more than 50 years since the excavation?
The initial scientific paper emerging from the Perry Mastodon find, written by Scott Adams and George Fraunfelter in 1973, was related to the site's environment at the approximate time of the Perry Mastodon's death, focusing on freshwater mollusk shells, as well as the residue of ancient plant and algae materials. Wood spruce samples found in the sediments alongside the skeleton were radiocarbon dated shortly after the excavation and yielded an initial dating of approximately 11,000 years before the present, at the tail end of the Pleistocene epoch. The type and distribution of mollusk shells, along with the spruce and algae materials found alongside the mastodon, also indicated the environment to have been a temperate climate, but cooler than today, with the animal's remains likely deposited in a floodplain lake. The U.S. Geological Survey had previously mapped this area as primarily being Gray's Lake peat, indicating that the soils were formed from glacial processes related to kettles, which are lakes and ponds resulting from glacial melting.
Detailed examination of the mastodon skeletal remains by expert consultants and by Wheaton College's own scientists indicated that the Perry mastodon was likely a female, due to its size and maturity. It was in the prime of life, about 9 feet tall, and perhaps 30 years of age. So more a Katy Perry than a Perry Mason, if you will. And there was little or no definitive evidence of butchering of the animal bones, or of scavenger teeth marks on the materials recovered, suggesting that the animal was not hunted by humans or scavenged by local predators. The lack of scavenging also hints that the animal's remains were covered over by water or sediments fairly soon after perishing. However, the cause of death of this mastodon specimen has not been determined with any certainty. One hypothesis is that the cause of death was related to the two right legs being broken, as is evidenced from the recovered bones, although it is not clear whether this leg break was during life or post-mortem. The leg breaks may have resulted from scenarios such as breaking through thick ice, trampling by other mastodons or mammoths, or possibly even a rolling log in a landslide.
In addition to being superbly preserved as a result of being covered by anaerobic silts beneath the Perry Pond, another singular aspect of this mastodon specimen is its spectacular tusks, which are longer and more curved than a typical mastodon specimen. In some respects, the Perry mastodon tusks are more akin to a mammoth tusk than to a mastodon tusk in both size and shape. The tusks can provide an accurate indicator of the animal's age, as the tusks exhibit growth rings, with annual growth denoted as rings along the length and cross-section of the tusk structure.
The recovered partial skeleton of the Perry mastodon was disarticulated, meaning that the skeleton had fallen apart after decomposition. The distribution of the remains along a 40-foot-long area suggests that the bones had been moved over time by natural processes, such as the movement of water or gravity. But since the skeletal remains were relatively close together, this also indicated that the bones had not been moved any great distance from the place of death or decomposition.
In 2010, Wheaton College had samples from the skeletal remains radiocarbon dated from an independent lab. This was possible as the mastodon bones had not been fossilized, but were instead well-preserved bone materials. The calibrated radiocarbon results came back even older than the earlier 1970 dating of the spruce material, and at a fairly tight confidence interval, at 13,700 years to 13,400 years before the present.
The work has not stopped there, however. Dr. Stephen Moshier, geology professor at Wheaton College, has continued research on this important find and site. In 2013, Dr. Moshier used a state-of-the-art geoprobe rig, as well as more traditional hand augers, to more extensively study the stratigraphy of the Perry Mastodon site. Using these newly obtained core samples, he and his students were able to paint a much more detailed picture of the Perry Mastodon site stratigraphy, showing that the skeleton had been buried in a shallow lake deposit, a lake that was likely significantly larger than the current human-modified lake. Their study confirmed that at the time of the Perry Mastodon's death and deposition 13,000 years ago, the local climate was cool and wet. The ancient Churchill Woods landscape was a patchwork of boggy wetlands with forests of black spruce. The Chicago area was again in bloom, as the last of the Ice Age glaciations retreated northwards, and the Great Lakes basin swelled with glacial meltwater.
A few months back, we caught up with Dr. Stephen Moshier, professor of geology and chair of the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois. Dr. Moshier was kind enough to give us a guided tour of the Perry Mastodon display at the Myers Science Center on campus, as well as to share his profound knowledge of this specimen and the 1963 Mastodon excavation. Approximately how much of the specimen was excavated at that time?
It's really hard to get a handle on exactly how much of it because there are different figures on how many bones are in a mastodon. A mastodon's never been found articulated, that is, all the bones connected. So it's somewhere in the low 200s of total bones, and we probably have a little over 100 total bones. So it's less than 50% probably.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the Perry Mastodon reconstruction was done?
Oh, it's a fascinating story. It really started as soon as the bones were pulled out of the ground. There was an effort to clean them, and it was remarkable. They were in such great shape. They had been in an environment with not a lot of oxygen, so it was kind of anaerobic. That means that the bacteria weren't there that could really decompose the bones. So they were able to clean them off just with garden hose, and then they dried them out. There was concern that drying might, destroy them, but they really stood up well, except for the tusk. The tusk didn't survive very well. We have them restored, but that was more difficult. So they immediately soaked the bones just by painting a mixture of alcohol and shellac. And that, at the time, was the best practice. It really made some of the bones look like refinished wood. And then they had the bones preserved because they were dry and they were protected, and then they could go on with the work of reconstructing the skeleton. The tusks really were never on display because they just didn't, they're not a porous material, and they just didn't take the preservative. So it wasn't until about 10 years ago when the tusks were restored. When we did the restoration about 10 years ago, before moving to its present location, we hired professional restoration experts that work in paleontology, different kinds of museum work, archaeology, and they removed with solvents the shellac that had been put on 60-some years ago, and they replaced it with a new sealant, which probably 60 years from now will be seen inappropriate, and then they'll do it again. But now we think we have a state-of-the-art preservation.
Since this was excavated in 1963, what additional studies have been done related to this find?
Well, we were able to go back to the site in 2013, the summer of 2013. We worked with the Illinois State Geological Survey using their coring truck, created these push cores, which are like little plastic tubes that retrieve all of the soil and subsurface material. Fortunately, there's rock, but not solid rock. All of this was above all of the sediments associated with the Mastodon excavation and find are above the hard bedrock. So they were able to give us a continuous record of the sediment from the grass in the soil down through the target zone where the Mastodon was found. But we couldn't do that work where the Mastodon was found because now it's underwater. It's a pond. So we chose locations around the site, and were able to put together a three-dimensional stratigraphic picture of the subsurface. And indeed, we only confirmed what we already knew, or what people already knew, that it had been buried in a lake environment, that then the lake turned into a bog. So there's a layer of lake sediments, a layer of peat, which is basically just a lot of wood fragments, wet wood, soggy wood fragments, and then on top of that, different soil layers that accumulated since the lake had completely dried up and was silted in. Now, this was a wetland area, and that's why the judge, Judge Perry, wanted to do the excavation to create a pond when the bones were discovered. He just wanted to turn the wetland into some nice picturesque ponds behind the neighborhood where he lived.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the actual excavation when they found the Perry Mastodon?
Sure. It's called the Perry Mastodon because it was found on the property of Joseph Sam Perry, who was a very prominent individual in DuPage County and in Chicago. He was a federal court district judge, presided over some really important cases in the 60s and the 70s. He had this property in Glen Ellyn, which today is right on the edge of the western limit of the Churchill Woods Forest Preserve. And his property drops off into the DuPage River floodplain. And it was a wetland, and he wanted to dig some ponds. So he hired an excavator from Naperville. His name is Marshall Erb, and he and another guy were excavating one day. It was in early October 1963, and they pulled up with their drag lines, great big drag line kind of machine. They pulled up what looked like the back of a human skull. Well, it turned out it was the back of a leg bone, a femur. And so they pulled this thing out of the mud that they were pulling out to make the pond, and realized they had this huge bone. And all they could think of was dinosaurs, because they'd never seen anything like that. Judge Perry was contacted. He knew all the editors of newspapers in the area, so he started calling newspapers. And one of the local newspapers contacted Wheaton College because they wanted some expertise on what this might be. So a biology professor and a geology professor drove out. This is a Wednesday afternoon, and they said, well, this is probably one of the elephants that lived in this part of the world during the Ice Age and shortly after the end of the last Ice Age advance. And it was so muddy that they didn't really have any success in finding anything else that day. But they came back the next day. They continued to pump water out of this, future pond, and Dr. Block found some more bones. So he excitedly called back, and more of the geology department came back that Thursday morning, late morning, and then they really started finding bone after bone. The next day, they brought in an expert from the Field Museum who taught them how to make plaster jackets for some of the more fragile bones, like the skull and the tusks. And they continued to excavate through Saturday, took a break for the Sabbath on Sunday, at Christian College, and then on Monday they just did a little bit of wrap-up work, but they really were not finding any more substantial large bones at that point, and then they ceased operation. So it really was a 4, maybe really only a 3 full day excavation.
That's incredible.
So Steve, we heard you're writing a book about this topic. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I've felt that there really needs to be a book on the mastodon, about its natural history, about the men and women who were involved in the excavation. There was one female geology major at the time, and she went on to be a very prominent geology librarian at Stanford University. And there are some of the other young men who were involved in the excavation, had very distinguished careers in geology after they graduated from Wheaton. Judge Perry is a fascinating person, and so were Dr. Block and Dr. Boardman, who were involved in the excavation and the reconstruction here. So it just seems like a story that needs to be told, as well as just the iconic status of the mastodon on campus.
We'll put the links to his book in the video when it's out. It won't be.
Well, I'm on chapter 6 of probably 8 or 9 chapters, so it might be a little while before it gets out.
Keep checking the description.
I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, we'll update it once the book's published.
Yeah, thank you.
If people want to find out more about the Perry Mastodon, where should they go?
Well, one place to look is our college website, which is wheaton.edu, and you could probably just do a little search and you'd find Perry. We have a slideshow that shows the students and the faculty excavating, some of the pictures of the restoration, and then a little bit about the study that we did in 2013 on the site.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming
today, and it's a wonderful display.
Thank you for coming.
Is it still possible to view the Perry Mastodon excavation site today? To get a glimpse of this ancient landscape? The answer is yes. Thanks to the mission of the DuPage County Forest Preserve in acquiring and preserving open space and natural habitats within DuPage County, Illinois.
The site is accessible today along the western edge of DuPage County's Churchill Woods Forest Preserve. We recommend accessing the site via an entrance at the end of Plum Tree Road in Glen Ellyn, Illinois, which can be reached via foot, bicycle, or automobile. As this is a residential street, however, and not a formal Forest Preserve entrance, we suggest that you park legally, of course, do not hinder or block driveways, and be respectful of the homes and private property along the street and adjoining the Forest Preserve.
From the north end of Plumtree Road, head directly north along the grassy trail for about 250 feet, roughly 100 steps or so, where the trail meanders briefly to the west, then north again, until you see the water's edge. This rivulet drains from the Perry Pond to the west into the DuPage River to the east. Turn left and head west along the stream, about 400 feet, and you'll then be walking onto a small peninsula on the east side of Perry Pond. Directly across the pond, a little more than 150 feet away, looking west, you can see the approximate location of the 1963 excavation of the Perry Mastodon.
The wetlands surrounding you are not wholly dissimilar from 13,000 years ago. And using a little imagination, you can get there from here. Instead of houses, manicured lawns, and deciduous trees surrounding the site, imagine a coniferous forest dominated by black spruce. Reeds blanket the edge of the waterways, with brush and tall wild grasses filling in the open spaces between the trees. A large beaver dam sits astride the pond in front of you. Wild fowl, including ducks, geese, swans, and cranes, nest along the shores and fill the air above you. Off in the distance, you hear the call of an unfamiliar animal, with deep and mysterious resonances, slowly approaching. Branches crack, twigs snap, the tremor of a heavy footfall, and you realize that you're not alone.